Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War news update, first part thereof for the 4th of January 2024. Had a late one last night, so I'm a little bit later getting to it today. Sorry about that, people. Right, let's go to where we normally start. Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveat supply, and you can find them in the description to this video below. Okay, so we have 780 personnel lost in a single day, as according to the Ukrainians. That is fairly high, but not as high as we have seen. Slightly higher than I think than yesterday. We're down in the 600s yesterday, if I remember correctly. 12 tanks, so that's gone back up from I think 0 yesterday. 21 armored personnel vehicles and 28 artillery systems. So we're back up to fairly significant numbers across the categories, even though they might be lower than we've seen at like max peak loss times. They are still pretty significant. 28 artillery systems is going to hurt. And we looked at the stats analysis the other day from Dell's stats that he's compiled from these general staff figures, and saw that like the degradation of the Russian artillery pieces seems to have got to a point where the Ukrainians are finding fewer targets over the last sort of, I guess, 3 weeks or so, and that is possibly reflecting that they just have fewer artillery pieces that are actionable and operational, and that then seems to be translating into firing 10,000 rounds a day at a fire rate. Now, although that's 5 times what the Ukrainians are firing, that is 6 times less what some claims were of the Russian fire rates back at the peak sort of fire rate times of the war earlier on in the war. So the Russians are having to get ammunition from abroad, from North Korea. We know that is a fact, and that would suggest that they don't have the stockpiles of their own ammunition. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to do that. They don't have the production rate of their own ammunition to keep them firing at previous rates. So I think ammunition shortages plus a lack of artillery pieces is translating into a fire rate that is a fraction of what it was. Now, the Ukrainians have that problem as well, but it's probably more the ammunition shortage than the artillery piece shortage, although I'm sure they can do with more of that as well. Okay, moving on to multiple launch rocket systems, 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, lower numbers of drones and cruise missiles, although there'll be a 1-day lag on that. 32 vehicles and fuel tanks is pretty high. So the Russian logistics are still being compromised, and 6 pieces of special equipment is fairly high in that category. So a pretty bad day at the office for the Russians. Just another day of this consistent degradation of their kit. Now, when we look at Andrew Perpetua's lost stats from surveying the socials, one must stress that there will be a drone bias in the kind of drone selection bias in these stats that I've talked about before. But as you can see here, the ratios are still very much in favor of the Ukrainians. That's about 3-1 Russian to Ukrainian loss there, although obviously it would be nicer if the ratio was even higher, in terms of sort of as high as 5-1 would be preferable, obviously, if you're pro-Ukrainian. Right, then when we look at the equipment, there is a recovery vehicle has been taken out. That'd be fairly high value, just due to the fact they just don't have too many of them. A couple of boats, we often see them on the list these days. A few bits of artillery, tank, IFV, couple of APCs, and a decoy thrown in there as well. So it's a book decoy, important because not only is that a decoy working, but actually it's not significant loss in terms of the list of losses. So you can almost take that one off, and that will improve the ratio slightly. Now, when you look at the Russian losses, that Zoopark 1M is a radar system that will be pretty high value. Losing that's going to be annoying for them. We've got the recording of we've got imagery of the Zoopark. We've got a recording of the Zala launch van that was taken out with, one presumes, the crew and the Zala drone that you see being collected in. So it looks like 2 crew members, a drone, at least 1 drone associated with the van, and the van itself. That's a lot of expertise as well as equipment that I think is high value for and worthy of a HIMARS strike. So you've got a GRAD, so that's a multiple launch rocket system on there. Kamikaze MTLB, we'll talk about that in a bit. Well, in fact, let's talk about it now. So the Russians are loading up MTLBs again and sending them towards the Ukrainian lines. This is in Novomykhailivka, where they've sent that vehicle packed with all sorts of munitions, including FAB bombs, and blew it up to clear the mines around Novomykhailivka so they can assault Novomykhailivka. So that's something they're still doing. And then when you look at the BMPs, you've got a lot of our infantry fighting vehicles listed here, a couple of BMP ones, but mainly the newer ones, as we've discussed a number of times previously. Only a couple of tanks there, and then quite a few trucks and civilian vehicles to add to that. So fairly high losses there for the Russians. That would go some way to supporting the general staff figures, and then also to support the idea that the Ukrainians are having a better time of it at the moment than the Russians. The Russians are attacking, and in attacking are losing a lot of equipment. All the while, the Ukrainian artillery is working, although at a far less of a far rate than previously. The assumption could be that they have greater precision. That's been the case over the course of the war, especially given that they do have access to more PGNs, presided guided munitions, than the Russians to fire from artillery such as Excalibur. I have seen fewer cluster munitions being used recently, and there's some really interesting data on drones that will come to as well. So lots to say there. I think this again shows that the Ukrainians are moving in the right direction in terms of attrition. Now, let's go on to that drone analysis. This is from someone who's been using Andrew Perpetua's statistics, actually. So Andrew collects a lot more data than he releases. There's an awful lot of spreadsheets he has as he looks at all sorts of imagery that comes out to do his mapping. Alongside his mapping, he does a lot of data collection for different strikes that he comes across and then notes them down. So actually he's a real font of knowledge and stats and data that is just waiting to be analysed. Anyway, someone has done that. So Danielle here says, the use of FPV drones from both Ukraine and Russia has long been a constant feature of daily updates from the front lines. The following research has been conducted on Ukrainian and Russian drone usage using data collected between August and December 2023 by Andrew Perpetua, and aims to evaluate the usage of FPV and Lancet drones. And he looks very much, in fact, he tried to skew 2/3, he said before, Russian imagery and threads, so that he can't be accused of being biased towards the Ukrainians. So anyway, to continue. To begin with, it is known that Ukraine has sourced a significant number of FPV drones from various companies and private initiatives, with some of these coming from foreign sources. Accurate figures attributed to foreign producers are difficult to obtain, and therefore any estimate would be speculative. Russia, however, has heavily publicized its own increase in FPV drone production, and several research articles have already covered this topic, and that's referenced later. To date, the topic of loitering munitions, particularly the production of Lancet drones, has been covered in both Russian and Western media, but extrapolation from recent data is yet to be conducted. And again, further reference. We can begin by examining the total number of attacks on infantry over a recent 4-month period carried out by both sides using FPV technology, first-person view drones. This will exclude any attacks carried out using reusable drones. I've decided to use data from August 2023 to December 2023, as this time marks a period during which Andrew identified and catalogued each individual type of FPV and Lancet strike. This data shows a progressive increase in drone strikes against infantry. Until November 2023, the Ukrainians were consistently able to score more strikes on infantry than the Russians. However, this situation changed in December, but not with the expected dominance one might have expected following Russia's 2023 production of FPV drones on a large state-driven scale. Lancet figures are irrelevant in this context, since the cost of Lancet drones only justifies its use on high-value targets, with open-source evidence consistently demonstrating this. In other words, okay, so we're forgetting Lancet drones for strikes on infantry because they are not used to strike on infantry. They're too expensive to use to do that. Okay, so from August to December, the Ukrainians have outpaced the Russians in terms of the use of first-person view drones against infantry. at fair, particularly in October, fairly significant difference there. Russians would then catch up in November. December, the Russians overtook the Ukrainians in the use of FPVs on infantry. So that's pretty significant. We see an awful lot of footage of the Ukrainians doing that, but of course that's our own, well, at least my own selection bias. Now, what she says here is that actually that given the claims to the production capacity of the Russians and supposedly being that much higher than the Ukrainians, that overtaking of the Ukrainian numbers is not significant, as in is not huge, right? You would expect it to be higher given the number of drones they're claiming to be making. Okay, a greater difference occurs in the comparison between Russian and Ukrainian strikes against vehicles. I think this is massively important. So Ukrainians hold a position of complete dominance over their Russian adversary in this area. Russia registered a similar trend, but at a much lower number of strikes. Thus, any previously anticipated Russian FPV dominance is not a reality supported by evidence. This could be due to a lack of training or an increase in Russian assaults along the front lines. The Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive, however, was ongoing in August and September, so more successful Russian strikes against Ukrainian forces should have been observed. In addition, the use of Lancet follows a similar trend. However, its impact has not been decisive. Okay, just go back to the previous bit of data. The strikes on Ukrainian infantry from Russian FPV drones spiking going upwards hugely does also coincide with the Russian offensive. So it switched from being the Ukrainian counteroffensive to the Russian offensive. However, you do not see that replicated in strikes on vehicles, and there are lots of theories that you could put forward. For example, I mean, one reason I would give is that there just aren't as many Ukrainian vehicles thrown near the front lines in risky positions as Russians, I would say. And Russian assaults, this is the time of Russian assaults, and they're doing heavily vehicle-led assaults. And so the Ukrainians are going to be hitting them with first-person view drones. But there's also just an absolute ton of evidence of Ukrainians hitting civilian vehicles and trucks, as in civilian vehicles used by the Russian military, like Bukankas, SUVs, things like that, and trucks and whatnot, with FPV drones. And I just think that we could say that the Ukrainians have more drones, arguably. They're using drones more frequently. They have better trained people. These are all different theories we could propose, and they could all be true, or some of them, none of them, whatever. They could have more trained individuals, and that would be supported by the claim that United 24 has trained 10,000 drone operators, and that's been ongoing since then, and so there'll be more than that now, so on and so forth. And that the Russians just have more vehicles closer to the front line able to be hit by Ukrainian FPV drones than the Ukrainians have to be hit by Russian FPV drones. Okay, so here we have this huge difference where the Russians haven't really increased. In fact, they've decreased in strikes on Ukrainian vehicles, and the Ukrainians have decreased as well, but the numbers are pretty staggering. 331 in September, 490 in October, and that would be a lot to do with Avdiivka happening in October. I would argue that will play a major role there. In November, 449, and dropping to 345 in December, but still like 3.5 times what the Russians were doing. So that's really, really important. Okay. Right, let's have a look to see what needs to be said. Where did I get to? Right, let's go to the next one. So the analysis of data on a day-by-day basis is necessary to examine the historical trend on the usage of first-person view drones during this war. The data on infantry strikes reveals that both sides have exhibited similar results, with the exception of a significant spike on October the 6th, when Ukrainian FPV drone operators were likely active around Avdiivka. During this time, the impact of the Lancet was comparatively insignificant. When we examine the data on vehicles, however, we can observe a clear difference between Ukrainian and Russian strikes, with distinct averages and minimal influence from the Lancet observable. The average number of daily strikes for Russia was 4, compared with 13 for Ukraine, indicating more extensive use overall by Ukraine. Even by combining the Russian FPV strikes with the Lancets, the difference is still significant. So the Ukrainians have a real advantage in FPV drone usage and drone usage in general against vehicles. From August to the end of the year, Russia used 1,485 FPV drones, while Ukraine used 2,874. The figure below shows the total usage, allowing us to extrapolate the following. 1. It was widely speculated in the spring that Russia had achieved dominance in the production of FPV and Lancet drones. Despite this, some may argue that Russia has yet to use those stocks and has in fact retained this weaponry in storage. Nevertheless, in an attritional war such as this one, any low-cost, widely available weapon that can destroy high-value targets is likely to be utilized en masse and when needed by either side. This goes to what I was saying to you previously, that I didn't believe the claim that the Russians were producing 300,000 FPV drones a month, and that was 6 times more than the Ukrainians. This was exactly what I said. The Ukrainians were claiming to be producing 50,000 in the month of December, I think it was, and the Russians are claiming to produce 300,000. I said, if the Russians are producing that many, you would see that production reflected on the front line. You're not seeing it reflected on the front line, and here's the data to suggest that. So I'm really happy that, because sometimes I wonder, imposter syndrome, whether I know what I'm talking about and whether my speculations are just pulled out my posterior. But actually, this is backed up by data, and that's really good. Okay, so this was evidence in Ukraine's heavy use of FPV drones, which has become due to its notable lack of large caliber mortar and artillery shells. 2. Lancet is not as threatening as previously thought. It is capable against lightly armored vehicles and equipment like radar. However, its cost and its presence and the presence of decoys makes it less practical and favors cheaper FPVs. 3. Ukraine has demonstrated its capability to sustain and consistently deliver FPV drones to the front line. However, more is needed to save precious artillery shells for future offensive maneuvers. It's also important to highlight that the Ukrainian army has been successful in introducing the figure of FPV operators, as they did for traditional drone operators. This will likely lead to the retention of such dominance, thanks to the advantage built and the lower likelihood of losing experienced drone operators who are now also being hunted down by Ukraine drone operators. So it's slightly mangled there, but the Ukrainians have introduced loads of drone operators. They are now a thing, and you've got this consistent training in place, and so you are consistently going to get an organized approach to drone usage, and with that, the Ukrainians have gone about hunting down apparently Russian drone operators as well. So that will keep, if that's successful, will keep Ukraine dominant in this area, so on and so forth. Anyway, conclusions. To conclude, the Kremlin's most effective weapons are propaganda and panic. However, reliable data and accurate numbers can counteract them and help us see through the fog of war. The data collected suggests that Russia is still not able to outmatch Ukraine in terms of FPV and loitering munition use. Although the situation could change, we have received alarming news of Russian FPV drones fabricated in China. This news further confirms that Russia cannot outproduce Ukraine in this area. It will be crucial to keep track of these attacks and identify any changes in trends which currently favor Ukraine in a traditional winter war. And then it goes to give thanks to all the people involved in that data analysis. So, as someone says here, my suspicion is analysts took Russian claims about ramping up drone production at face value, and they should know better. It's hard to be sure, but whenever Russia announces something like this, you know a ton of money is getting skimmed off and much less is actually delivered. And the thread author says, yes, that's totally true. They invest a certain amount and get something different. I'm sure that in an attritional warfare, any drone would be used. The Russian fighting with one hand tied is a lie. If you don't see And if you don't see this, it's because they simply do not have it. This does not mean we should claim victory. We should support any activity in FPV drone production and development. Really good analysis. Really happy to see that. And it does confirm some of my speculations previously that Russia don't have the drones that they claim they do. And if they do, then they're using them for some bizarre reason, because it doesn't make any sense that they wouldn't use them. Okay, to add on to sort of figures and whatnot, in the past few days, more photos confirming that no longer only Russian male prisoners are being sent to the front in exchange for offers of freedom. It's now women as well. So there's a photo here. I can't tell if the person behind is a woman, but certainly the one in front is. They both look like it could be, but the one in front looks like a Bratyan woman. So Putin likely, it really is going to kill everyone in Russia before this is over, says Jane Kiev. So that's an interesting data development as well. And sorry to use humans in terms of data and whatnot, but you see what I'm saying. Glasnost says, I want to live. This is the telephone hotline for Russian troops to surrender. It's increasing numbers of Russian soldiers are surrendering in Ukraine and denouncing Russia's unprovoked war. So let's go and look at what's said about this in the Financial Times, to which he is referring. I want to live. Russians defect to Ukraine by calling army hotline. The 12 men handed themselves over to Kiev after calling the I want to live hotline, set up for Russian troops who want to defect and operated by Ukraine's military intelligence unit, the GUR. Their surrender, known as Operation Berenya by GUR, in reference to a Russian folk dance, provided Ukraine with valuable battlefield intelligence. So it's not just about getting these troops off the front line, it's also about interrogating them and getting information about goings on the front line. As of December, more than 220 soldiers have given themselves up through the hotline. Vitaly Matvinenko, a spokesperson for GUR's Department for Prisoners of War, told the Financial Times. More than 1,000 other cases were pending. Matvinenko added, disclosing both figures for the first time. I thought the figures previously were much higher for those who have surrendered, but there might be a difference between those who have surrendered and those who have surrendered exclusively using this hotline. GUR set up the hotline in September 2022, just 3 days before Russian president or dictator Putin's partial mobilization. On top of the roughly 190,000 troops involved in Kremlin's initial invasion in February that year, Moscow was mobilizing some 300,000 reservists. The I Want to Live hotline started ringing off the hook, and the figures for the phone calls are pretty staggering. The hotline has so far received more than 26,000 calls via phone and an accompanying chatbot on Telegram Messenger. Its website, Chuzhit.com, has been visited more than 48 million times, including 46 million visits from within Russia. The website was blocked inside Russia days after it went live, but remains accessible via services that hide the user's internet address, so VPNs. The I Want to Live hotline is staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, by 10 operators working from a secret location in Kiev. The team is composed of military psychologists and analysts whom Matvienko said were specially trained to speak to the Russian soldiers. Aside from the difficulty in finding a safe place to surrender, Russian soldiers live in constant fear of their own comrades turning their guns on them, as recorded in battlefield videos and phone intercepts consulted by the Financial Times. Quote, when an enemy calls you in tears saying that he wants to live, he needs to be calmed down, that Matvienko said. Still, the soldiers often need some convincing. Many Russian troops believe that what they see and hear from the Kremlin and its state media, that Ukraine is led by neo-Nazi regime out to murder the Russians. Ukrainian authorities promise not only that they will live, but will also be treated well in line with the Geneva Conventions on the handling of prisoners of war. Other guarantees include medical care, 3 hot meals a day, communication with family back home, and of course the likelihood of being exchanged for Ukrainian POWs and returning home to Russia, and probably returning back to the war. For soldiers who fear their lives will be threatened if they return to Russia, GUR offers some possibility of applying for asylum in Ukraine. Matvienko said the hotline had experienced several spikes in calls. The first came in November 2022 around the Kherson counteroffensive. Several Russian soldiers who found themselves stuck at their positions after being abandoned by their comrades, called the hotline to surrender peacefully, he said. Another wave came in spring as Ukraine was gearing up for its latest counteroffensive. In March 2023, we received almost 3,000 applications, Matvienko said. That compared to December 2022, when there were 1,500 applications. Ukrainian military officials and battlefield commanders say one reason Russian troops often abandon their posts and turn themselves over to Kyiv is poor treatment from their own commanders. So really interesting stuff. And then on top of that, Ukraine's military intelligence report Russia stopped giving leave to its injured Russian soldiers, as so many of them are deserting once back in Russia. And due to grossly overcrowded medical facilities in occupied Ukraine, lightly wounded Russian soldiers are refused treatment. So all not going well for the Russians in some of those contexts. Right. There has been some activity by, I guess, I don't know whether it's special forces or partisans, but on the night of January the 4th, a Su-34 military plane burned down at the Shagol airfield in Chelyabinsk. Ukrainska Pravda has reported, citing sources in the security services. According to UP sources, Defense Ministry's GUR is behind it. So it burnt down at the airfield as a result of a Ukrainian operation of some sort. On top of that, there is a rumor, don't know if this is true, but that a plane went down in Belgorod, as a Russian source says. But this is interesting. They whispered to us that our plane has just been shot down in the Belgorod region. Let it be a lie. So whether that is shot down by its own air defenses, I'm not sure. Whether it didn't happen, it might not have happened at all. But just to let you know, there's a rumor out there of that. And then we go to this... this Zoopark system, sorry, I just messed up there, destroyed Russian Zoopark counter-battery radar, presumably Zoopark 1M, from December 2023. So this one was on a list today, but it's not like it didn't happen yesterday or anything, but it is a high-value radar target that has been taken out. We are seeing a lot of this happening, and each time this happens, that reduces the Russian capability to do their own activities in acquiring targets and taking them out. So it's, as I talked about yesterday, this vicious cycle. There's a HIMARS strike, as I mentioned earlier, on this Zala team here. So there's just a little van with two guys. They bring in this Zala drone, and then the whole thing gets HIMARSed. And the question might be, is it worth that HIMARS strike? Yes. So when you look at these Zala drones, you think, well, it's not the same value as a HIMARS missile, but actually two expert drone operators, the drone equipment, the launch systems or whatever, the van with all the stuff in, and the drone. Those people and that drone can be responsible for spotting for all sorts of hits on Ukrainian targets, which is an opportunity cost of far more than the value of the monetary value of the HIMARS missile. So it's really important stuff like that happens. Anyway, now I've shown you, or at least referenced this several times before, but there's new footage, really clear footage of what happened in this Sinkivka column attack, where these four vehicles, I think the fifth one came along later, but are completely blown apart. And that's not the five that are already blown up, the six that are already blown up there in that image. In fact, there might be something back there as well. But anyway, I can't show you this, but you should go and watch this. It is a really good bit of footage to just show how desperate things are for the Russians. So you've got a tank at the front with a mine roller on. That mine roller does nothing. I mean, that tank fundamentally disassembles, and then all the other vehicles come up behind it, and they all get hit either from ATGMs or mines, and it all goes wrong. And it's just really indicative of how the Russians do things and what's happening to their equipment that then feeds back into these figures. Right. Russian General Igor Trifonov was killed in the war in Ukraine, according to Russian media. He was sentenced to 9.5 years in prison, so had been in prison in a case of bribery and illegal possession of weapons. It's reported that he'd been seeking a contract with the Russian Defense Ministry for a long time and was able to go to war in the end of 2023, and then he ended up dying. So there is that. And then Russia on fire or a strike, not really sure, but multiple Russian Telegram channels are reporting that an electrical substation in Moscow caught fire. It's fairly significant. I mean, you can see it from quite a distance. So Russia is in minus 27 degrees heat or temperature at the moment. Coldness is incredibly cold, and that took out the power to 3 districts, I think. So this was pretty significant. Right, moving on, because I've done too much talking and analysis. Moving on to distant strikes. Overnight, Russia attacked Ukraine with 2 Shahed drones. Both of them were shot down, so far fewer. Again, the question is why only 2. If they had enough drones, they would be surely doing them night after night to just overwhelm, exhaust those those air defense munition stockpiles. Any gap you gives Ukraine a chance to gather themselves and to get more munitions in. And so therefore, when you have like a large wave of attacks and then it goes quiet for a little bit, all I can think is that actually the Russians don't have the stockpiles of drones that I think that is being claimed by the Russians, right? Okay, UK defence. Sorry, I'm looking out the window and all the birds are finally packing on bird feed. About time. I haven't seen birds for ages in the garden. It's been a quiet year for birds. Anyway, random. UK Defence Ministry, Russian attacks shift focus from energy to defence industry. So this has definitely been the case. And what we don't know is the damage the Russians have actually done with their missiles, all those cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, Kinzhals, Shaheeds that have been sent in multiple waves. Some of them have got through, and those that have got through would have hit their targets, and their targets appear to be the defense industry. They've moved from striking the energy infrastructure that we saw last year that ostensibly failed as a tactic. They didn't cripple the energy infrastructure to a significant enough degree. The winter was also fairly warm, given climate change and whatnot. It was just a very warm winter, and the Russians just failed to achieve their goals. They've now switched to hitting defense industrial military complex targets, and I think that's a very sensible thing to do. If I was Russian, that is. So if I was a Russian commander, that's what I would do. So I think they're quite sensible in doing that, and they will be having some effect on production. Now, the question is, have the Ukrainians put their production facilities in safe enough places? Are they having are some of these places predominantly underground, so on and so forth, so that even if the areas are generally hit, that it does cosmetic damage or doesn't do fundamental damage to the production of weapons and munitions, etc., etc. This is so important that Ukraine's industrial military complex is able to function, because this is the way through a lack of support from places like the US at the moment, with like 3 months of Congress impasse in terms of $61 billion of aid. Goodness me, like, how well have Ukraine done in the last 4 months, considering they haven't had that aid? Imagine if they had $61 billion worth of aid, like what they could do. Goodness me, like, it really does give me hope that when that does come through, and I'm pretty sure it will, that things will be hugely different. Okay, Kharkiv was hit in 2 separate strikes yesterday. S-300s were the likely missiles, surface-to-air missile systems used in the ground attack mode. So not a lot of information about that. Civilian, non-residential infrastructure. So not quite sure. In the free part of Donetsk region, a big rocket attack near the front line. So Kurakhoved, that's behind Novomykhailivka. That's why Novomykhailivka is an important place to keep defending, because actually Kurakova behind it is more important, and it gives it a buffer to there. But it does get hit, as you can see here. School, garden, clinic and cafe have been virtually destroyed, and apartment blocks were damaged. Also, you've had strikes on Nikopol, which is to the north of the Zaporizhia reservoir, and what else? Ochakiv here has been hit, so that is north of the Kimburn Spit, northwest of the Kimburn Spit, which is a sort of port on the Bug River estuary, where the Ukrainians used to do Marines training there. I don't know if they still do, because it is in range of Russian artillery. I hadn't heard of that being hit by artillery, because I thought it had gone a bit quieter on the Kimburn Spit from Russian artillery, but obviously still active there. The coastal town was particularly targeted, and there was a fire at an energy infrastructure facility with hundreds of households without power. So, on the other hand, Russia is still being evidenced as bombing themselves or having issues with their own missiles. As Darth Putin, the parody account, says, the last thing we want is more evidence we bombed ourselves again. So TASS says the mayor of Belgorod, so this is Russian state media saying, Valentin Demidov has asked local residents to avoid publishing photos and videos of the consequences of artillery bombardments. So this then is tallied with a 22-year-old from Belgrade being shown publicly apologizing alongside two men bearing Smersh insignia after filming a Russian air defense system in action. Look how threatening this is. Two Russian soldiers standing with their backs to the camera making this guy apologize. If I lived in Russia and thought, do I have freedom? Do I have liberty? And I look at this guy, oh no, it turns out I don't. There's been talk of Russia reviving Stalin's notorious counter-intel organization, but no official confirmation yet. So Smersh, that's not good news. Now, what else has happened in the Belgorod region? Well, Russian channels like Zest Belgorod have distributed videos and pictures of missile fragments which damaged civilian properties in Belgorod. And what was interesting, these were later taken down. Once they realized that those were booster sections of a 2-3YA6 missiles of the Russian Pantsir S-1 air defense system, they deleted them. In other words, there are several bits of footage of Pantsir rockets going through Belgorod buildings and landing in Belgorod fields to show that actually the Russians are doing a pretty good job of bombing themselves. And indeed, here's another one. Images from Belgorod again, Russia, of a Russian FAB 500 UMPK. Not for the first time. That malfunctioned and crash landed without exploding. Maybe they ran out of washing machines. Yeah, so this is a guide kit on a Russian bomb. Didn't explode, but it's landed in Russia in a field. Meanwhile, in Tokmak, occupied Tokmak in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, loud explosions are heard this morning, so that's being targeted. And then after an attack of unknown drones on a substation in Zheleznogorsk in Kursk region, so again in Russia, the city was completely cut off from electricity and heat supply. Gas stations, shops and ATMs stopped working in some parts of the city. Stores are mostly sold out of water. So these are strikes that the Ukrainians are doing, it appears, on Russian energy infrastructure and having some success with the limited drones that they do have at their fingertips. Right. For that kind of thing, although they are ramping up their production of those. Okay, moving on to other bits and pieces. This is a massive explosion, like I talked about earlier, but that well, not like I talked about earlier. This is the explosion from that MTLB that was packed with FAB 500 bombs and other explosives to clear a minefield near Novomykhailivka. I can't show you that, but you can go and search it on Twitter. I have an artillery unit who just told me that they have been holding their positions for half a year nearly and now have to start falling back because of the lack of ammunition. It's dropped 80 to 90% from 6 months ago. So 6 months ago, they were firing whatever they were, and now they're firing 10, 15% of what they were previously. So this Ukrainian Estonian source saying the West needs to effing wake up, you are costing lives. So the idea here is that they desperately need artillery ammunition. Like I said earlier, they've got the pieces, the artillery pieces, as is implied here. They just don't have the ammunition. So the fire rate being at 2,000 is an ammunition problem. Right, 2,000 a day, where it should be, they did get to being above the Russians, and it was sort of inching to, so it's 8,000, I think, a day across the front lines, and that's obviously gone right back down. That's now a quarter of what it was, and in some places for this particular group, that is 10% of what it was. This day's become a little better, says Ilya Ponomarenko, the former Kiev independent journalist, because 230 Ukrainian service members are coming back home from Russian captivity. Congratulations, everyone. So there's a massive prisoner swap yesterday, which included Budanov. I think it was his birthday as well. So the intelligence chief was involved in that. It's the largest exchange of POW since the beginning of Russia's invasion, and I believe they're going to be doing another one soon as well. So lots of people were freed, people who are fighting all sorts in Azovstal, in Mariupol. You've got armed forces soldiers, National Guard, Navy, Border Guard, and some civilians as well. Sergeants, soldiers, officers, a whole shebang. I think the Russians got 248 people back, and there'll be another one to follow soon, I believe. So it's good that's back online. SBU's cybersecurity chief said the hackers who accessed the Kyivstar, who hacked into Kyivstar recently and brought the system down, apparently had been doing so for months before that. They were in the system for months. Ilya Vityuk, the cybersecurity chief, said that he was pretty sure the attack was carried out by the Russian intelligence-linked Sandworm group. So basically, bad faith actors from Russia under the orders of the Kremlin, of the state. So it's pretty obvious that that's who's going to be doing that. And then I just thought I'd dip into a bit of Security Council spokesperson John Kirby here.
Thank you, Ukraine. Admiral, back to Ukraine for a minute. It was well chronicled earlier in the war the heavy losses the Russian military took in terms of equipment, firepower, and such. In the wake of this recent barrage, though, launched on these Ukrainian cities, what is the current U.S. assessment of just what the Russian military's currently capabilities?
Interesting that they have to keep reaching out to other countries to shore up their inventory of artillery shells and missiles and, of course, drones. A lot of these drones that were launched in the last 72 hours were Iranian-made or Iranian-designed drones. We know that this war has had an impact on Mr. Putin's war-making capability, particularly when it comes to munitions, artillery, drones, missiles. We also know that he still has a sizable amount of his Air Force available to him, a sizable amount of his ground mechanized capability available to him. And of course, while his Navy has been challenged in the Black Sea, it's really only been the Black Sea fleet that has been affected. He also has an advantage in manpower because Russia is just a bigger country. And he doesn't have to, unlike President Zelensky, he doesn't have to answer to the Russian people about mobilizations and taking prisoners out of jail cells and putting them on the battlefront. He has gone through an enormous amount of manpower in the last 2 years of war, and we know that he's going to continue to try to throw manpower at it. All that said, Jonathan, that's on the plus side of the ledger for him. On the negative side of the ledger, command and control in the Russian army is still abysmal. Morale, leadership, absolutely at the dirt floor. They are still heavily reliant on long-range kind of strikes because they got that available to them. When they engage the Ukrainian forces on the ground, they're not having much success. For this so-called ballyhooed counteroffensive that they were going to launch themselves, they've really achieved nothing in recent weeks and months. This is a military that still has not really learned the lessons that you would think a modern military would learn after 2 years of war.
So that's a really damning indictment at the end there of where the Russians are at. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Take care. Speak soon.